Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to VBC Greatest Generation Live. I'm Todd DiPastino, and I'm the director of the Veterans Breakfast Club. We are a nonprofit based in Pittsburgh, where all of a sudden today it became winter with big, heavy snowflakes that created ugly slush on the roads, covered our lawns, covered our cars, and so we're kind of crabby about it, but we're very happy to be here on Greatest Generation Live because tonight we're marking the 80th anniversary of the sinking of the Juneau on November 13th, 1942. A Japanese torpedo ripped into the side of the USS Juneau, sinking it and killing 5 brothers, the Sullivans from Waterloo, Iowa. Glenn Flickinger is going to be hosting a remarkable conversation with a wonderful group of people, including the granddaughter of one of those Sullivans, Albert Sullivan. Kelly Sullivan's joining us. We're very grateful to her. And I'm just going to be the wingman tonight. Excuse me?
I might just add, and the grandson of the captain of the USS Juneau.
Correct. And I am just going to thank our sponsors and then throw the program to Glenn. So let me thank, first of all, D&D Auto Salvage. Of course, they are our perennial sponsor. They've been sponsoring our programs here on Zoom for quite some time, and we're very grateful to them. They're also going to be sponsoring our upcoming breakfast we're having on Friday at Penn Hills here in the eastern suburbs of Pittsburgh. They are an auto salvage and metal recycling company. They've been around for 50 years. They have 2 locations, one in Tarentum, one in Lawrenceville. We encourage you to use it if you have any metal you would like to recycle, or if you have any salvaging that you would like to do for automobiles. We are also sponsored by Tobacco-Free Adagio Health. We're very proud of this one because they are a nonprofit that focuses on the health of families and women, especially, and they have a robust line for addressing veterans issues and also encouraging veterans and all Americans to quit tobacco use if they can. They help people quit tobacco. They encourage policies. They advocate for policies, I should say, that encourage healthier places to live, work, and play. And you can find out more about what they do at tobacco-free.adagio.com. That's .adagiohealth.org. Man, I'm out of practice. That Veterans Day week just threw me off. So I'm going to throw the program now to Glenn. Thank you, Glenn, for hosting.
Got it. Thank you very much, Todd, for the introduction. So as Todd referenced, we have an incredible panel, if you will. I don't know if I use that word very often, but I think once you get past 2 or 3 guests, we can call it a panel of experts on the naval battle of Guadalcanal, the sinking of the USS Juneau, its captain, Captain Swenson, and the 5 Sullivan brothers who passed. So Jeff Ballard, say hello. Jeff is a frequent contributor to our programs. He's an historian and an expert on the Pacific naval battles. Jeff, say hello and tell us what you've been doing lately.
Hi, well, this is a very busy time of the year for me, and this is particularly busy because it's the 80th anniversary of the battles that I've really been studying since I was 14 years old, when my dad first gave me a copy of Samuel Eliot Morrison's Struggle for Guadalcanal, and that really kicked off my love of naval history, and particularly the battles in the South Pacific. Thank you for having me.
So when you were 15, just 15, 20 years ago. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay.
New map.
Next, let me introduce Pat Kinney from, let me get this name right, the Sullivan Brothers Iowa Veterans Museum. Do I have that correct?
Right.
Okay. Pat, tell us a bit about the museum and what you do there.
Okay. The Sullivan Brothers Iowa Veterans Museum opened in 2008. It's dedicated to telling the stories of all Iowans' service from the Civil War to the present. We have several exhibits related to the Sullivan Brothers, including a recreation of their house and living room at 98 Adams Street in Waterloo, A number of artifacts, including one of the brothers' motorcycle jackets and motorcycle clubs, some letters that were sent to them that were returned after their loss. Exhibit on the fellow, their friend that died at Pearl Harbor, that prompted them to enlist in the Navy together. But we have exhibits on every conflict that Iowans were directly involved in from Civil War up until now.
Interesting. And where is Waterloo in Iowa? Is it?
Waterloo is in northeast Iowa. It's about 3.5-hour drive south of the Twin Cities, about 5 hours west of Chicago. And we were a railroad crossroads at one time, but now I think we're probably best known for, besides the Sullivans, for John Deere tractors and University of Iowa wrestling coach Dan Gable.
Yeah, I actually followed Dan Gable fairly well. I came from a high school wrestling powerhouse, and he was a legend when I was growing up. So I didn't know he was from Waterloo. So
yes, indeed.
Well, thank you very much for being on, and thank the museum for lending us your expertise too tonight. Okay. And next we have Knut Swenson. Knut is the grandson of Captain Lyman K. Swenson, Lyman Knut Swenson, right, who was the captain of USS Juneau. Knut, please say hello and tell us a little bit about your background.
I live in Huntington Beach. Excuse me, because I had a bad cold. I'm losing my voice first. But I live in Huntington Beach, same as Jeff, pretty close. I've actually read a lot of stuff that Jeff has written, and it's amazing that we're so close. I've gotten to know Kelly and Pat quite well. I've been back to museum 3 times now. It's fabulous. Love the town of Waterloo, like the Waterloo Bucks baseball team. I've stayed at Kelly's house. My father, Robert Swenson, also attended the Naval Academy. And when he graduated in 1944, the Lyman K. Swenson, the ship named after my grandfather, was just being commissioned. And, around that June, so he was actually on the Lyman K. Swenson for the last year of World War II. It was said to be a coincidence, but who knows?
Yeah. And we've got some great pictures of your father that you sent to us that we'll put up in a bit. And then last but certainly not least, we have Kelly Sullivan, who is the granddaughter of Albert Sullivan, one of the 5 brothers, and the daughter of Jimmy Sullivan. Do I have that right, Kelly?
Correct. Yes.
And tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you've put a lot of time and effort into telling the story of the Juneau and the Sullivan brothers.
Yep. Well, first I'll warn you, I'm actually a 3rd grade teacher. So it's all about Pokemon and rainbows and unicorns in my world. But so when I'm not a 3rd grade teacher, I love to spend time with veterans and tell the story of my grandfather and his brothers. I kind of got into this accidentally when I became the sponsor of USS the Sullivans. So I am the proud sponsor of the Navy's greatest destroyer, USS the Sullivans DDG-68. And I was actually in high school when the Navy Department came to me to ask me if I would be the sponsor. And that's kind of how it all started.
Wow.
I do public speaking on the Sullivans. Actually, I'm going tomorrow to Ankeny Centennial Junior High to do a presentation. And I'm super excited because there's going to be a World War II veteran there.
Oh,
and
wow.
Because it's a Veterans Day program. It's a Veterans Day program. They're doing a breakfast and it's going to be really neat. So I get to do some public speaking. I'm also on the board of the USS the Sullivans Foundation. And that's a foundation that we started to help sailors and veterans, and especially the 2 ships named after my family. And I feel very blessed to be here today. Thank you for having me. I also, a big shout out to both Pat and Knut. So Pat has been the official Sullivan historian for years. And so he's really written every article, because he used to work for the Waterloo Courier, every article that was ever written about the boys. And Pat, I was just thinking about 5 years ago, you and I were in Staten Island, New York, cutting the town up, and with the sailors, because the Sullivan ship was there for Veterans Day and also the 75th anniversary. And then, as I mentioned, Knut came into my life too, a great friend. And my favorite memory of Knut, which makes me tear up, is he got to throw out the first pitch at the Waterloo Bucks game. and he wanted to get some practice. So we were in my backyard throwing the ball. And he looked over at me and he said, Kelly, you know what? Our grandfathers, they're looking down from heaven right now. And they're super proud that we're out here playing catch together. And it's just, I didn't end up with the big family, Irish Catholic family I would have had, but you know, I have really special people, and it's such a blessing that I definitely don't take for granted.
Yeah, that was special. I was going to tell that story later, but
Well, it makes me cry when I tell it, because I'll never forget that.
Well,
that
the realization that we lost our grandfathers on the same day also.
Yes.
Anyway.
Sure.
And you were the one that came up with it. I mean, and it was, I think we both had like just all the feels. We looked up to the sky and you were the one that brought it up. And it was just, it was something that I will never forget how I felt when you mentioned that. And it was just, it was profound. We have a special bond that is not something we want anyone to have, but it's still something that we have, that we both lost our grandfathers on the same day.
No, that's a wonderful, wonderful connection. And thank you for sharing that with us. Great. Okay, so what as always happens, we have till 8:30, and I know we're going to get rushed at some point, so let us get started. Okay. So the first and most difficult step is for me to pull off the technical element of sharing the PowerPoint correctly. The share sound, because we've got these couple of clips. Okay. We're ignoring that little thing. We've decided that didn't matter. And let me expand it to get it on the whole page. And am I doing okay? Is everybody seeing this?
Yep.
Okay. Just the title page, right? So we the four of us went through a bit of a preparation for this, and we're going to try to track through the story and show you 3 wonderful video clips that the clips themselves take 18, 19 minutes. So we got to be careful about our timing, okay? And as always, as our audience has questions, please raise your hand. Todd will be watching for raised hands, and or put it in the chat room, and Todd will be monitoring that. And I'll pause at least 2 or 3 times at different points to invite questions, okay? So we thought we'd start with our naval historian, Jeff Ballard. And Jeff prepared this slide and the next few that you're going to see. Jeff, what's going on in the fall of 1942 around Guadalcanal? Why are we there? And how did these naval battles ensue?
Sure. Well, it's important to remember that in early 1942, the Germany first was the American policy. But Admiral King, who was the commander-in-chief of the Navy, commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet, he desperately wanted to take the fight to the Japanese in 1942. So really, King willed this Operation Watchtower to happen, which was called for the seizure and occupation of New Britain, New Ireland, and New Guinea area. Where that fight would begin in the Solomon Islands. And King had originally selected Tulagi, which was an island that's about 20 miles across the Iron Bottom Sound from Guadalcanal as the location for the first offensive, because he wanted to secure the natural harbor there as a seaplane base. It was subsequently discovered that the Japanese were building an airstrip on Guadalcanal. And if the Japanese were successful in completing that airstrip, then they would be able to sortie twin-engine bombers down into the Coral Sea and potentially disrupt the lines of communication between the United States and Australia.
Ergo, we invade, the Marines land on Guadalcanal on August the 7th, 1942.
August 6th,
Okay. And the Marines, at least, didn't call it Operation Watchtower. They called it Operation Shoestring, because it was pretty much like last month. We if you were on, any of you were listened, we did the program on the 32nd Reserve Division, also with some Iowa components in it, at the Battle of Buna in New Guinea, right, which occurred more or less the same time as Guadalcanal. Both of these operations, the U.S. military, and you'll hear this about the Navy, was totally ill-prepared, not well trained, not well equipped, but the bravery of the fighting men, sailors and soldiers and Marines is what's amazing, is what they did with so little. So, okay. So this is just another shot of that Jeff shared. This is the north coast of Guadalcanal. This would be what, Lunga Point, right in here. And this is the airstrip, right?
And I'm sorry, you're correct, Glenn, it was the 7th of August. But so when the Marines landed on Guadalcanal, that really kicked off what amounts to 6 months of, the most intense fighting at sea and in the air and on the land. Some of the most intense fighting of the entire war, and it was really all about who would control this airstrip.
Right. And as we were talking the other night, I mean, if you look at the Pacific War in general, it's obviously a lot of naval battles, a lot of aircraft carrier engagements, a lot of incredible battles on the land. But it was all about taking these airstrips and controlling the airstrips. And this was the first one. Okay. So that's the macro sort of setting, and we'll get into the naval battle in just a little bit. But Knut, we thought we'd start with your father.
Grandfather.
I'm sorry. Geez, I did that last night too, and I'm sorry. With your grandfather. Want to share some background, some stories about your grandfather?
Yeah, he graduated from the Naval Academy in 1916, along with Casson Young and Captain Hoover. They all knew each other from, they graduated from college the same day. They died the same day, or Casson Young did. And, prior to being assigned to the Juneau, he had led a destroyer division escorting Roosevelt to meet Churchill at the Atlantic Conference in Newfoundland in 1941. And he was commander of the USS Twiggs until October of 1940. That ship, interestingly, when I was just reading about it, was turned over to the British Navy. And then my grandfather took command of the USS Juneau. It was launched in October of 1941. Of course, he was the only captain of the Juneau, and it was commissioned, I think Valentine's Day of 1942, if I'm correct, Jeff.
Yeah.
And I think the one thing that I asked my Utah side of the family, how does a guy from Utah with 5 brothers on a farm end up at the Naval Academy? He had the Viking name. His father was born in 1824 in Denmark, I believe. So he was 60-something years old when my grandfather was born. The response from the Utah family that I just got today was, Lyman Swenson was a natural-born leader with God-given talent and skills that would ultimately push him into his destiny of being a great leader of men. And, everything I've always heard about my grandfather is similar to that. The one thing, and I guess Jeff and everybody else will get into this later, is that he took the cruiser Juneau to Annapolis in April of 1942. My dad was going to school there. He was out in the bay for a few days. My dad went and met him, and just a couple things my dad relayed to me is, like, number one, he didn't think he was going to make it back. He was in a thin-skinned cruiser. As Jeff has said, it was being rushed into war. And he was also pretty stressed about having the number of brothers on the ship. There was, I think, 8 sets of brothers, 4 Rogers brothers, including obviously the 5 Sullivan brothers. But but Sullivan stuck together. The Navy publicity machine had sort of already kicked in on that and recruiting posters. So I think from his standpoint, he was a 50-year-old captain thinking about all these young men. He went to sea with a handful of officers, handful of warrant officers. And from that April, they had to train all these guys that had never really been in battle before. And as it ended up, it was heroic, and they stopped the Japanese, and they never got past where they stopped them. And for that, I'm very proud of him.
As you certainly should be. This is another picture of your father. This I took from a file that I found, an article I found on commissioning day. That's your father on the left, correct?
Grandfather.
Grandfather. I'll apologize 5 times now, Knut, for what I'm sure will continue making that mistake. Your grandfather on the left, and this was like a logistical supply officer on the right, congratulating him on commissioning day. Yeah. Quite your father, just looking at his picture, has a certain air of authority and command about him.
Yeah, he was all about the Navy, without a doubt.
Yeah. Okay. And this is a picture of the Juneau shortly after commissioning, and its first mission was in the Atlantic Ocean. Do I have that right, Jeff and Knut? Yeah.
Right.
And it was actually the first Navy ship to be commissioned in its North Atlantic convoy camouflage. They were rushing them into service so quickly.
Did it maintain this camouflage in the Pacific?
No, this is the North Atlantic convoy camo.
Yeah, to make it blend into that North Atlantic weather, right? And Jeff, describe what we mean by a light cruiser. Why was it a thin-skinned light cruiser? Doesn't sound like anything I'd want to be on if I had a choice, which I'm sure nobody did at that time.
Well, it was designed, the Juneau was the second of 10 Atlanta class cruisers, and the Juneaus or the Atlantas, their mission was really fleet air defense. So their job was to protect the fleet carriers, and in order to do that, you'll see they had an interesting configuration. They have 8 mounts, twin mounts for 5-inch 38 caliber guns.
Along in here.
6 along the center line, and then there's 2 at the waist by the aft structure, the after deck house. And so really these were dual purpose guns. They could be used against surface targets, and they would be, but their mission was primarily fleet air defense. And they had a tremendous suite of 1.1 and 50 caliber machine guns as well.
Okay. Picture of the crew, which I just found fascinating. About 700 men on serving. Pat, do we have that number about right?
Yeah, almost 700.
Almost 700. Yeah. Hard to believe there's 700 in that picture, but maybe there is. I'm not going to try to count them. But among them are I'm sure the 5 Sullivan brothers and the 8 other sets of brothers that were on the ship. So, okay. And this was taken also, as you can see there, February of 14th of 42 at commissioning, right? So we thought we would play next before we have Kelly and Pat speak more precisely about the Sullivan brothers. This video, it's about 3.5 minutes or so that Pat very generously shared with me, with us. So I think I'm going to have to back it up. No, there it is.
The 5 Sullivan brothers were
hearing it okay?
Up in Waterloo, Iowa. They joined the Navy after Pearl Harbor. They joined the Navy together on the agreement by the Navy that they would be able to serve on the same ship.
you know, that, I mean, their motto was that they stuck together. So looking at my dad and my uncles, I can understand why they wanted to be together, or any siblings would want to be together.
They joined the Juneau, the USS Juneau, a light cruiser, on Valentine's Day, 1942.
The way I understand it, they were in a group of ships off of Guadalcanal, and there was a Japanese submarine that fired a torpedo that was not actually meant for them. It was meant for the San Francisco, I think it was called. And it missed the San Francisco and hit the Juneau, which is a light cruiser, which they were aboard, and it hit right in the magazine where all the ammunition is, and the ship just exploded. And the only people that survived were the ones that happened to be on deck. The rest of them were just immediately gone.
And they were lost at sea in November 13th, 1942.
To me, they were heroes. And I just felt like they did it. I wanted to do it. I can't tell you why, but I felt that it was my calling to go into the Navy. My dad and my uncles were in the Navy, so I felt that I should go too. Of course, I wasn't a hero, but...
As far as Iowa, they were 5 young blue-collar guys who were fairly well known in the city. So Waterloo as a city took the loss, very hard. I mean, everybody sort of knew one of the brothers, knew the folks. They lived in the north end of town by the railroad tracks. And so they were well known, and all of a sudden, these men are gone.
And it's not only my dad, my uncles. There were a lot of sailors in World War II that lost their life. Every one of them, we should remember all of them. It makes me feel good about the Navy, about the military, and everybody that serves.
Well, here at the museum, we use the 5 Sullivans to represent the service and the sacrifice of all Iowa veterans from the Civil War to present. So in that sense, no other family has sacrificed as much. And we believe that's an important story to tell. I mean, that's 70 years ago that happened. And for the young people who come through our building, that loss is history to them. But every year we send out young men and women to serve in Iraq, Afghanistan, as well as other parts of the world. That sacrifice in terms of being gone and that sacrifice in terms of losing family members is still there. And so it's a reminder that whether it's one individual or whether it's 5 individuals, we are still putting people in harm's way. And 1, we need to support them. And 2, when they are lost, we need to recognize their service.
Well, Pat, that's extremely well done. Thank you for sharing that with us. That was produced by the museum, is that correct?
No, that's from the United States Navy History and Heritage Command.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
pretty well done. I think it was done in 2017. It looked like from the year on it. So.
And who was the one historian in that?
That's my colleague, Bob Niemeyer, who's been at the museum 20 years. We have 2,000 oral histories of veterans from Iowa, and Bob has done the bulk of them. I've done quite a few since I got here about 4.5 years ago, but Bob did a lot of them. Sometimes we did them side by side. I'd interview somebody for the paper and he'd record them for the museum.
Okay. Excellent. So he's still at the museum.
Yes, he's a state-renowned historian. He was just received an award from the Iowa Historical Society in 2018.
Well, between him and Kelly, that's quite a repository of knowledge about the Sullivan brothers.
Yeah, sure is.
Yeah. Okay, I stopped sharing screen for a minute, so let me go back. Chad, as I go back to sharing screen, are there questions that anybody has so far? And then we'll move on to Kelly. Todd? Are there any questions, Todd? Oops.
No questions.
Okay. Let me go back to this. So Kelly, this is the incredibly well-known, famous picture of the five brothers. This must give you chills every time you look at it.
Well, yep, it's right here in my living room. I get to see it every morning when I'm having coffee. Yep.
And do I have it right? This is your your grandfather, Albert.
Yes. Yep.
Let's
the youngest of the five brothers.
Let's identify the five here, left to right. This would be who?
That one is Joseph.
Okay.
And then Frank, Albert, and then Madison or Matt,
okay.
And then George.
Okay. And one or two of them were in the Navy previous to the war. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. George and Frank were actually in the Navy before Pearl Harbor. They were on the USS Hovey. And so my great grandmother, Alita, when she wrote a letter to the Navy trying to find out what had happened to the boys, she wrote in there, you know, that she had the honor to go aboard their ship out in California. So,
yeah.
No.
And what is the story behind them wanting to join together, besides perhaps the obvious that we might already know? But is there something else that you
right? You know, their good friend Bill Ball was on the USS Arizona, so they wanted to avenge their friend's death, and that's why they went in. A lot of people don't know that my grandpa Al wasn't actually going to go. He was going to stay back, and it was going to be just the four of them. And my grandma told me, she said, you know, I just thought I was going to get a break from him for a few months. Everyone needs a break once in a while. She didn't realize, you know, how difficult it was going to be. But, you know, they were best friends. They did everything together, and that's just what they wanted to do. And the movie, The Fighting Sullivans, you know, they show that they went down together and tried to go in together and were denied. And George wrote a letter. And so I teach third grade, and we do opinion writing and letter writing. And I tell my third graders, you know, the power of a letter. So George wrote a letter to the Navy Department and asked that they all be together. The Navy actually chose that as a wonderful public relations opportunity. And so they were all over the newspapers even before they were killed. And so the Navy asked my great grandmother to christen a ship. So she was supposed to christen the USS Tawassa, but instead, of course, she christened the ship named for her boys. And there's a Pittsburgh connection with all that, because the boys had their pictures all over the news, and they started getting love letters from women all over the United States. I know, right? Isn't that, well, they were handsome guys from the Midwest, handsome guys. I always laugh and tell people it was kind of like eHarmony back then, you know, with that. And there was a girl named Margaret Jaros from Pittsburgh, and Margaret's best friend dared her to write a letter to Joe, who they called Red because he had red hair. And she did. She wrote him a letter, and they started a mail correspondence back and forth with letters. And then when, of course, he was in pre-com in New York. So when he had leave, he'd get on the train and head to Pittsburgh. So I had the honor to come out to Pittsburgh and speak. And we had a whole bunch of USS Juneau families there. And my friend who's a priest out there, Father Vince, he surprised me and brought Margaret Jaros' daughter to the event. Oh. I'm actually wearing a brooch. I don't know if you can see it, that my Aunt Genevieve, so this is one of my favorite personal artifacts, Genevieve, which would have been her future, because they got engaged, Joe proposed, she gave it to, my Aunt Genevieve gave it to Margaret Jaros. And then Margaret Jaros' daughter gave it to me when I was in Pittsburgh. So I wear that every time I public speak and do speeches, so that Genevieve's kind of with me. Yeah.
That's just a great story. What a human interest story that is.
Yeah.
And for us Pittsburghers, it just proves again, Pittsburgh is the center of the world. I mean,
yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a beautiful story. We'll come back to you in a minute here, or maybe this next picture that Jeff shared. These are the Rogers brothers, and Jeff or Pat or any of you. All four of these at one point served on the Juneau, but then two of them left. Is that correct?
That's yes, correct. The two middle boys, Patrick and Louis, they remained on the Juneau, while the other two brothers left, Joseph and James.
And do we know why they split up? Were they concerned about the risks that they were taking?
Well, I'm certain that, Newt's grandfather was, I know that he was concerned about the Sullivans. He must have, I know he was concerned about all of the crew of his ship, but he recognized that if worse came to worse, it would be a tremendous blow to the family. So I'm sure that he, if not encouraged them to think about splitting up, at least he certainly thought about it.
Yeah. And Canute, you've expressed that, at least to me, and I think you might have said it earlier, your grandfather was concerned about the 8 set of brothers that were on the ship besides the Sullivan brothers. And I suppose,
yes, again, from the standpoint of being a 50-year-old naval officer and have a lot of kids from 17, 18, 19 in their 20s, I think he had a different perspective. I think he knew the danger a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I believe that's what my father indicated to me, that it caused him a lot of stress.
Yeah. It's that old axiom of war: when you're 18, 19, 20 years old, you pretty much think you're immortal and it can't happen to you.
Right.
50-year-old guys know it can happen to anybody. So.
Yeah.
And Kelly, how old was your father at this time?
14 months old. Yeah.
I'm sorry, your grandfather. How old was your grandfather?
Oh, I'm sorry. My grandfather was 19.
And back to your father, Jimmy, who we saw in the video, he was just 14 months old.
Right, 14 months. Actually, I think Al was 20. I think he just turned 20. Yeah. He was 20, but yeah, my dad was just 14 months old.
And are there surviving family members from the other brothers?
No, my a lot of people don't realize the generational impact that this tragedy had on the Sullivan family. Because only one of them was married, Al Sullivan, the only child of the 5 boys, was my dad, Jim Sullivan. So it's just me and my brother, and my dad.
Yeah. That's you hear that so much. I read and do a lot of work on World War I too, particularly from the English point of view, where so many families were wiped out in the war.
Exactly. It really did. It wiped out the family completely. But they had a sister, Genevieve, and you think about what Genevieve's life was like after that, because she was the only child left. There was a family of 6, and then it's just Genevieve, and she joined the Navy Waves and helped do her part. So it's really neat the way the Sullivan family persevered after they died. And she had 2 boys who are still living and live here in Waterloo, Tom and Murray Davidson, but neither one of them married or had kids.
Okay, so let's go on and get into the story of the sinking of the Juneau. This is another shot, such an excellent shot that Jeff shared with me. This is the airstrip, what was renamed Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. And what I want to point out here are these, what you look like moon craters here. These are shell holes from the Japanese battleships, cruisers, that were coming down the slot and bombing or shelling Henderson Field most nights. Jeff, any other comments on this photo?
Well, there was also a pretty predictable air raid every day. The Japanese planes were coming from Rabaul, which was 600 and some miles away, and there was a series of coast watchers on various islands in the Solomons, and it was like clockwork. The Japanese would bombard the field in about the middle of the day. But periodically after the Tokyo Express dropped off their reinforcements on the island, they would swing by Lunga Point and send a few shells in the direction of the airfield. Sometimes random submarines would surface on the Sound and bombard the field as well.
This is a shot we found. These are actually Japanese warships coming down the slot. Now they left during the day and then would arrive at night in order not to be, hit by the planes from Henderson Field.
And that's a big part of this, the story of the battle, is that if they arrived, they had to leave. They left Rabaul during the day. They would, traverse the Sound all night. They would arrive in Guadalcanal around midnight and do what they needed to do and get out of there as quickly as possible, because if they were caught in the daylight by the planes that were on the Henderson Field, which was sort of this polyglot of Army, Navy, Marine aircraft that was called the Cactus Air Force, if they were caught in the daylight, then there was a good chance they would be harassed, if not sunk.
Right. So this is a map, and let's get into the action on November 12th and 13th, right? It's late night on the 12th and early morning on the 13th.
Right.
These were several Japanese battleships coming to bomb Henderson Field or shell Henderson Field, correct?
That's correct. This was the bombardment group that was led by Admiral Abe, Hiroku Abe. His job was to crater the airfield and destroy as many planes as possible, rendering the airfield unusable. Because following on behind him was a reinforcement group, and the plan was then that the bombardment group would lay waste to the airfield, and then the reinforcement group would be able to land their troops and return to Rabaul without being harassed by Cactus Air Force planes.
So there's two American admirals, Callahan and Scott. We have photos of them in just a moment, that are the senior admirals. Callahan is the tactical commander. Is that correct?
Yeah. Admiral Daniel J. Callahan was in tactical command because he outranked Scott by 3 days. Scott was the victor at the Battle of Cape Esperance on 12 October. It would have been made much more sense for him to command, but that's not the way it worked out. Callahan was commanding his first task force in wartime. Previous to that, he had been the Roosevelt's naval attaché, and he'd been the chief of staff of Admiral Halsey's predecessor.
And he's on which of these? These are the lineup of the American ships.
So I'm sorry, Callahan is on board the San Francisco. Scott is on board the Atlanta. Interestingly enough, Newt mentioned Kason Young. Kason Young is the captain of the San Francisco, and he was mortally wounded. He was actually we'll talk in a little bit about some of the Juneau survivors. There was a medical detachment from the Juneau that were on board the San Francisco because there were so many casualties. And Kason Young was one of those who was mortally wounded.
And these American naval ships are all cruisers and destroyers. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's 2 divisions of destroyers, so that's 8 destroyers. There's the one heavy cruiser, San Francisco, with its 8-inch guns, and the Atlanta, Juneau are both the Atlanta class and the aircraft cruisers, and then you've got Helena. So it's important to know that the weather was terrible. The weather was absolutely terrible. You can see the Americans are in this line of battle. The Japanese task force was in complete disarray. There were squalls in the slot. It was a heavy overcast. There was sheet lightning. The Japanese were not getting good intelligence from the Imperial Japanese on the island. They weren't sure whether that there were any American ships in the Sound. A couple of times Abe canceled the bombardment, and then it was back on, and they turned back around, and in the process, their formation got completely jumbled up, and they, where the Americans are in this nice long line of battle, the Japanese really they look like a flock of migrating geese.
Right.
So there was, tremendous overcast. There was sheet lightning. The Callahan had some intelligence. They had some radio intelligence about the bombardment group, the reinforcement group. They had gotten periodic reports about their progress throughout the day. So they were aware that the Japanese were coming, and they knew that they were the big guns. The Hiei and Kirishima were 14-inch gun battle cruisers from World War I, and Nagara was a heavy cruiser. The other ships are destroyers.
Mm-hmm. And what does Callahan end up doing in this? What becomes a real melee, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so apparently Callahan was a very religious man. He was very much resigned to his fate. He did not make any attempts to maneuver for advantage. He didn't attempt the classical naval maneuver where he would cap the enemy's T, and by presenting a broadside, he crashed headlong into the Japanese, and it really degenerated very, very, very quickly into a general melee.
Right.
In fact, it was described as minnows in a barrel. I think there was one sailor called it a barroom brawl with the lights turned out. It was really some of the most ferocious fighting, not only of the war, but since Jutland, or even since the Anglo-Dutch naval engagements of the 17th century.
I mentioned yesterday, it reminded me of reading about the Nelson at famous British, Trafalgar. He almost expected them to throw these people in World War II, almost to throw hooks over the side and try to board the ships. They were so close together.
They were very close. They were very close. The Cushing and the Laffey and the Street and O'Bannon, the lead 4 destroyers, had to maneuver radically to avoid collision with the Japanese.
Right.
And at that point, the formations intermingled. The first half of their formations, they were at paint scraping distances from one another. It was essentially NASCAR paint swapping. But there was a couple of things, though, that worked to the Americans' advantage. One was that the ranges were so close that the Japanese battleships could not depress their guns low enough to actually hit the Americans. So these giant 14-inch shells are flying overhead. The other thing is that the Japanese, who were planning on bombarding the field on the airfield, had loaded their hoists not with armor-piercing shells, but with these thin-skinned bombardment shells, which were designed to throw out a bunch of shrapnel and to kill light targets, buildings and people.
We do have a question, Glenn, from Jeff Witherell.
Okay, great.
Yeah, hey, Glenn, this is really interesting, gang. I'm trying to get the lay based on this map. Okay, were the Japanese already on Guadalcanal, and where were they located? And then where were the Marines, when you're looking at this picture, where were the Marines located?
Okay, so you'll see there at Point Lunga Point, the Marine perimeter was there.
Right here around this.
5 miles,
yeah.
Basically from the Matanikau in the west to a little bit past the Tenaru in the east. That was the Marine perimeter. It wasn't quite to Mount Austin. Mount Austin was still in Japanese hands.
What would happen is the Japanese, and by this point, the land battle's been going on for 3 months plus. The
Okay.
Japanese would land their reinforcements normally up here, sometimes over here earlier in the action, and they would make their way to the Marine perimeter. And there were 4 or 5 key battles where they tried to penetrate the perimeter and never did. Never did convincingly anyway. Okay. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. I'm just trying to get the understanding of where the ground forces were and all this. Okay, thanks.
So let's go into Jeff. What happens to the Juneau the night of the 13th?
All right, so the Juneau was the second light cruiser in that second half of the column there. Basically, because it was the heavy cruiser, the San Francisco was really heavily engaged with the Hiei, the battleship. Eventually, the San Francisco, a 14-inch shell on the flag bridge, and Callahan and his staff were killed. Scott and his flag staff are also killed, but they were killed by actually friendly fire from the San Francisco. Now, so the Juneau enters the melee, and they engage with 2 Japanese destroyers, the Nudachi and the Harusame, and also with the Kirishima and the Hiei. There, it again at very close distances, not as close as the first half of the column, but still within 100 yards of the enemy. Eventually, Abe calls a general retreat because his flag bridge is getting peppered with small caliber anti-aircraft shells, and he decides that he's had enough and calls a general withdrawal. The Juneau is actually struck by a torpedo. That torpedo knocks out its forward fire room. It loses steering control and it loses electric power to its turrets. So at this point, Captain Swenson thinks that discretion is the better part of valor and pulls out in order to keep its ship and crew safe.
Right. So the Juneau is not sunk in this general engagement on the night of the 13th.
It is torpedoed, and that torpedo later they'll discover that the keel it's broken the keel.
Yeah,
and that a crack along the short axis of the ship is developed.
But the 2 naval forces disengage. Japanese sailed north back up the slot.
Right.
Remaining American ships, many of which, like the San Francisco, are almost sort of a floating hulk at this point, right? Also retreat south, right? So the battle takes place right up here, and they retreat back south, heading towards what's not on the map is Noumea, New Caledonia.
Correct.
Okay. What happens along the way?
So in the morning, the ships that are able to, they rally and they exit the Sea Lark Channel the same way that they came in. There is the USS Helena, and Captain Gilbert Hoover is the senior surviving officer. Scott is dead. Callahan is dead. Kason Young is mortally wounded, and they are departing for Noumea. I-26 is the submarine is right off the coast of San Cristobal there. He's actually between the sinking location and the island.
Yeah, right here.
And he fires, as Kelly's father said, he fires a spread of torpedoes at the San Francisco. He misses the San Francisco. The Juneau is down about in the water, about 4 feet, enlisting heavily to the right, to the starboard. He's developed this crack in the hull, aft of the waist turrets. Captain Swenson is concerned that the ship could break up at any moment, so he orders that all of the lashings on all of the rafts be cut. And the torpedoes from the I-26 miss the San Francisco. They hit the Juneau at about frame 45, which is where the magazine was, right below the bridge superstructure. And the Juneau, it doesn't sink, it erupts like a volcano, and sinks in about less than, I think it was 42 seconds.
Right. Todd, this would be an excellent place to play that 3-minute clip on Wyatt Butterfield, I believe it is.
All right, I'm going to stop your sharing so that I could share my own, and we'll get that going. Here it is.
All of a sudden we had a alert 1, and I was the gun trainer on a 5-inch gun. The gun trainer on a 5-inch gun moves the turret to port and starboard, and the gun pointer elevates the guns up and down. Well, we had the alert 1, and we just assumed that probably some more airplanes were going to come in. I jumped in my turret, hopped into my seat, put on my earphones, pushed the button to talk to the director of control, and I said, "Dick, what's up?" And just as I said that, but zoom, and it blew me out of my seat, out of my shoes, over by the hatch door. Everything was black, and there were 9 other fellows in the gun turret with me, and all of them were killed instantly. I couldn't see anything, and when I got blown out of my seat, it blew open the hatch door to the turret, and my arm fell across the door. And by that time, this is a matter of seconds, the water was already up to my knees. So I figured, I knew it was an abandoned ship, and I was going to get out that hatch and get out of there fast and not wait for the captain to say, "All hands, abandoned ship." And just as I was starting to get up, the second torpedo hit, and it closed the hatch door on my arm, and I couldn't open that door. I banged my head and everything else, and eventually the water was over my head before I could get the door open, and I lost where the door was. I floated away from it, and I figured, "Oh my God, this is it. I'm going to die." I figured I'm going to die, so I started swallowing the oil and water right away. And while I'm doing this, I'm floating up, and I realized that the overhead, or ceiling as you call it, the overhead of the turret had been blown off. And I closed my mouth, frantically got up to the surface, and there was a life raft right there, and a life raft close by, and sitting in the other life raft was George Sullivan by himself. I climbed in there, into my raft, and started helping other fellows who were still coming up. Now, the 120-some odd fellows, I think I'm right, that's right around there, that had gotten off the ship, no one that we had talked to had jumped off. They were either blown off the ship or had gone down with the ship, as Lester had done, and myself, before they were able to get out. But any man below deck didn't make it. George, I saw him just that first day, and it was hard to recognize anybody unless you asked them who they were, because we were covered with oil from head to toe, and eyes were covered, and the sun reflection burning your eyes and what have you. But the saddest part was watching all the ships take off and leave us. We, for a very short moment when we surfaced, And Lester shares the same feeling. We figured, my God, we've all, most of us have made it anyway. They'll pick us up right away. And here we are screaming and howling for them to come back and get us, but they were gone. They figured everyone, as Vic said, they assumed that everyone had perished. It was such a terrific explosion. I know when I come up, I looked around, I thought I'd watched the ship go down, but it was nothing to be seen but a big cloud of smoke.
Wow. And that's the man from Pittsburgh.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. So, Jeff and Canute, any of our guests, Pat. So this occurs in broad daylight, the sinking, right? And the controversy is, to the extent there is that the San Francisco, and were there other ships nearby besides the San Francisco, do not stop to look for survivors. They just continue. And Canute, you were telling us about, now I'll get this right this time, your father's feelings about that event. Your father being a Annapolis graduate, serving in World War II, and subsequently, as you grow up, he spoke to you about that.
I must have been 10 years old. And I said, well, Dad, how come they didn't stop because they didn't want their own ships to get blown up. As a 10-year-old, it kind of made sense. But interestingly, my dad said, no, they should have stopped. They broke hundreds of years of Navy tradition, period. And on the other hand, Captain Hoover, that moved on, had already won 2 Navy crosses. He went to the Naval Academy with my grandfather, and Halsey immediately fired him, I think within days, when he found out that he didn't stop. Ruined it, ended his career, relieved him of his command. And my understanding is later on, Chester Nimitz spoke to Halsey and just told Halsey that might have been that was probably not the right thing to do, that Hoover was a good man. And, but my dad's version is, yeah, they should have stopped. Just like Mr. Butterfield was saying, we thought they would stop. And I think, Jeff, you've got some insight of that danger. Oh, one thing as a kid, I went to a football game at the Naval Academy. My dad goes, hey, there's this plaque dedicated to your grandfather. So I walk over and I said, oh, well, who's Captain Hoover, Dad? And apparently Captain Hoover, 20 years later, put a plaque on a chair at the Naval Academy Stadium honoring my grandfather. So it was such a hard call. I mean, damned if you do, damned if you don't, I guess. And, I told you my dad's opinion. I don't know, Jeff, you may have a little more insight on the danger if they had stopped than I would.
Here's a shot of the background.
Oh, you got that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Fascinating that Hoover was the captain of the San Francisco.
Of the Helen.
Of the Helen. All right. And this, Canute, is your father.
Yeah, that's my dad at the Naval Academy.
Yeah. He graduated what year?
He's in the class of 45, but graduated in 1944 because they graduated him a year early because of the war.
Right. Handsome young man.
Just like his son.
Yeah.
I was going to make a joke, but I decided not to. So, Jeff, Pat, or Kelly, any of your thoughts on this topic? This part of the discussion?
Well, not only did they not stop, they didn't even throw a life ring over. They literally quit the field. Interestingly, a B-17 saw the mushroom cloud from the explosion of the Juneau and passed over, and they counted. I think it was around between 120 and 140 some heads in the water. But even they didn't break radio silence. They continued on to Guadalcanal. Then they turned around and flew back to Espiritu Santo, where they filed a report that mentioned that there were survivors in the water, but the report was filed to the bottom of the pile, and consequently, these survivors waited some of them 8 days until they were finally rescued, and in the end, there was only 10.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the part that's really tough, because like Knut said, you know, you have to be in that situation to really know what to do. But I think the part that's really difficult to comprehend is how it was lost under paperwork, not once, but actually twice. And they were left out there for 8 days. My great grandmother, who lived with the family, she thought the boys had made it to an island, that they just couldn't call back, because some of the survivors did actually paddle enough until they made it to an island. So.
Yeah, Jeff, Juneau, was it 4 were picked up by a plane and 3 made it to an island? And
Yeah, 3, including Lieutenant Wang, made it to that San Cristobal, where they were rescued by natives and a Dutch planter.
So before I play this last clip, Todd, are there any questions, something from the chat room or anybody from the audience that would like to comment or ask a question of our guests?
Yeah, let me invite people to, you could wave your hand, you could raise your Zoom hand, you could put something in the chat here. We have some discussion, but not any questions for our guests.
Okay. So
Brad Washaball has a raised hand. Hold on a second. Let me ask Brad to unmute himself. Here we go. And we have Trey Berman also with us. Hey, Brad, I'm asking you to unmute.
Yeah, I got that. Wasn't the Navy also criticized by the Marine Corps for leaving them stranded?
I recognize this man is a Marine, guys, so.
Absolutely. Yeah, after the Battle of Savile Island, and the Marines wanted to know, well, where's the Navy? They even after the first day, the Marines were on half rations because they just could not get the Navy to supply the Marines.
But after the Battle of Savile Island, that was help me with this, Jeff, but that was a call made by, was it Admiral Fletcher, who was in charge of the aircraft carriers, who didn't want to stay so close to Guadalcanal, so he withdrew the air cover early,
Right.
and that left Admiral Kelly Turner, who was in charge of the amphibious forces, also feeling naked, and he withdrew as well. He withdrew the remaining support and supply ships.
Correct.
Yeah.
Trey Berman, if you want to unmute yourself, why don't you ask your question? Good to have you, Trey.
Thank you. Sorry I can't turn on my camera. My camera's just not working right now. But I was wondering more about the battle itself. You mentioned that the Juneau was an Atlanta-class cruiser, which is an anti-air cruiser. She was primarily armed with 5-inch guns, nothing that can take on any large Japanese warship. She did have 8 torpedoes on each side, but she really wasn't. She was designed to shoot down airplanes. I'm wondering why she was in a naval battle to begin with. I guess desperation, but I was really wondering why.
Yeah, absolutely. There was nobody left. The Juneau was there because they were actually attached to, I think it was November the 8th. They were attached to Admiral Callahan's task force, who were escorting 3 attack transports with the 182nd Infantry Regiment. So they were there because they needed ships to escort and because of the daily air raids, the attack transports were in danger of being sunk by Japanese aircraft. So it did make sense for them to be there for that mission, but their primary mission would have been to protect the Australians.
But this was also the decision made by Admiral Halsey, correct, Jeff? Where Halsey, had taken over from Gormley, and Gormley had been, relieved because King especially felt that he was too timid, whereas Halsey would fight, and that undoubtedly Halsey did. Halsey would just throw everything that he had in his repertoire of ships into the battle.
Right, and to the Marines' point, Gormley never went to Guadalcanal. He never talked to Vandergrift. He did send Callahan, who was his chief of staff. But when Halsey got there, he asked Vandergrift, "Can you hold?" And Vandergrift said, "Yes, but I need more support from the Navy than I'm getting." And that's when Halsey said, "Okay, I'll give you everything I got."
Okay. Ergo, the Juneau showed up along with the others.
Ed Cavo, you have a question.
Yeah, in the last clip we heard, he said that he got in a life raft with George Sullivan. Did I hear that correctly?
That's what he said. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and so what happened subsequently to George? Was he one of the people that just didn't make it after being in the water for so long?
The story goes that he was swimming from life raft to life raft looking for his brothers. And as they mentioned, their faces were covered with oil, so you couldn't recognize anyone. But there were towels laying around. He would wipe the faces, and that he was eventually attacked by a shark.
So just to be clear with the numbers, Ed, as well as I know them, and Pat, please comment. About 120 or 130 survivors of the Juneau went into the water, and they were left there for 8 days until the remaining 10 were rescued. So it's very similar to the story on the Battle of Leyte Gulf and the actions that took place there, where several hundred men were left in the water, not quite so long, for 3 or 4 days before they were rescued. And the majority of them did not make it.
Okay, thanks.
So if we could go to this, it's a little bit long, but it's 8:13. We've got time to show this and still wind up with some more question and answers. It is just a very well done film, and I'm going to play it now because I think it's worth our time.
Don't say when our weary times are happy, you're the whole world and go.
My name is Kelly Sullivan, and I am the granddaughter of Albert Sullivan, the youngest of the 5 Sullivan brothers. I'm also the proud sponsor of the second ship named after the boys, USS the Sullivans, DDG-68. I'm here today at the Grout Museum to honor the 80th anniversary of the sinking of USS Juneau, where my grandfather and his brothers went down after the Battle of Guadalcanal with all of their shipmates. On the day, November 13th, we think of not just the 5 Sullivans, but all the sailors who were killed that day. It's important for us to honor our veterans each and every day, not just on Veterans Day, but every day, to thank veterans and also their families for their ultimate sacrifice. Thank you for your service to our great country, and God bless America.
Dear sirs, I am writing you in regards to a rumor going around that my 5 sons were killed in action in November. A mother from here came and told me she got a letter personally, and he heard my 5 sons were killed. It is all over town now, and I'm so worried. My 5 sons joined the Navy together a year ago, January 3rd, 1942. They are on the cruiser USS Juneau. The last I heard from them was November 8th. That is, it was dated November 8th, US Navy. Their names are George T., Francis H., Joseph E., Madison A., and Albert L. If it is so, please let me know the truth. I am to christen the USS Tuwasa, February 12th, in Portland, Oregon. If anything has happened to my 5 sons, I will still christen the ship, as it was their wish that I do so. I hated to bother you, but it has worried me so that I wanted to know if it was true. So please tell me. It was hard to give 5 sons all at once to the Navy, but I am proud of my boys that they can serve and help protect their country. George and Francis served 4 years on the USS Sullivan, and I had the pleasure to go aboard their ship in 1937. I am so happy the Navy has bestowed the honor on me to christen the USS Tuwasa. My husband and daughter are going to Portland with me. I remain sincerely, Mrs. Alita Sullivan, 98 Adams Street, Waterloo, Iowa.
The USS Juneau was engaged in heavy fighting during the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Pacific during World War II. After a fierce battle, it and other U.S. ships headed to a nearby port for resupply and repair. The Juneau had already been hit by a Japanese torpedo and lost 19 men. The ship limped toward open water when it was hit by another torpedo. This one scored a direct hit on the ship's magazine, causing a terrific explosion that nearly disintegrated the vessel. Of the approximate 700 men on board, most died instantly in the explosion. Only a little more than 100 were thrown into the sea, injured, but still alive. My uncle was inside a gunner's turret with other sailors. All were killed instantly in the blast except him. The turret quickly filled with water, but he was able to escape and ascend to the surface. Covered in oil, he could see no remains of the Juneau, only smoke and bodies, some living and many not. He climbed aboard the life raft, and soon others joined him. They were surrounded by terrible sights and an empty ocean. They could not even recognize each other, as everyone was covered in oil from head to toe. This was the beginning of 8 days lost at sea. Over those next 8 days, he would witness over 100 survivors dwindle down to just a handful. Day after day, more men were lost to the vast, unforgiving waters of the Pacific. But still, he and a few others clung to life. On that final day at sea, they were spotted by a Navy PBY plane flying above. While the plane was capable of a waterborne landing, the pilots had orders not to land in the open sea. So the crew dropped a package with supplies and a note with pending rescue. The package landed approximately 50 feet away from the raft. The current was not working to their favor and quickly began to pull the precious supplies further out to sea. The men sat quietly in the moment's defeat while my uncle pondered his next action. He watched the sharks circle the raft and weighed the risks. Then he stretched out his arm, shook the other men's hands, asking that they tell his parents what had happened here today. One of the men handed my uncle his Bowie knife. He took it and slipped quietly into the water. My uncle would say that every second felt like an eternity, and those 50 feet seemed like a mile. He anticipated being attacked and kept expecting a shark's jaws to clamp around him at any moment. But nothing happened until he reached the package. As he swam back, he saw multiple sharks headed his way. While clutching the precious cargo, he took the knife and slashed wildly at the beasts. He felt the knife make contact and could hear the yells of encouragement from the men in the raft. Miraculously, he wounded one of the sharks, and the others were scared off. My uncle swam frantically and was finally pulled back inside the raft. 700 men served on the USS Juneau. 10 were rescued. My uncle went on to live a full and happy life, but he never forgot the terror and courage those 8 days lost at sea.
My dear Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, the knowledge that your 5 gallant sons are missing in action against the enemy inspires me to write you this personal message. I realize full well there's little I can say to assuage your grief. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I want you to know that the entire nation shares in your sorrow. I offer you the condolences and the gratitude of our country. We who remain to carry on the fight must maintain spirit in the knowledge that such sacrifice is not made. The Navy Department has informed me of the expressed desire of your sons, George Thomas, Francis Henry, Joseph Eugene, Madison Beaver, and Albert Liam, to serve in the same ship. I am sure that we all take heart in the knowledge that they fought side by side. As one of your sons wrote, we will make a team together that can't be beat. It is this spirit which in the end must triumph. Last March, you, Mrs. Sullivan, were designated to sponsor a ship of the Navy in recognition of your patriotism and that of your sons. I understand that you are now even more determined to carry on as sponsor. This evidence of unselfishness and of courage serves as a real inspiration for me, as I am sure it will for all Americans. Such acts of faith and fortitude in the face of tragedy convince me of the indomitable spirit and will of our people. I send you my deepest sympathy in your hour of trial, and I pray that in Almighty God you will find comfort and help that only He can bring. Very sincerely yours, signed, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Well, I hope you agree that was worth watching. Another just poignant tribute to not only the Sullivan brothers, but all of the men serving on that ship who went down under such terrible, terrible circumstances. Todd, are any questions? There's one other thing I'd like to ask Knut to do, but anything before I ask Knut?
Ken Kazak, let me ask you to unmute so you could ask your question here. I think it's a good one. Let's see. No microphone tonight. Okay, so Ken says, did Steven Spielberg ever say this story was the inspiration for Saving Private Ryan?
No, he never did. And to be honest, it was disappointing because they actually talk about the Sullivans in the very beginning of the movie. And Steven Spielberg and DreamWorks never reached out to the Sullivan family in the production before or afterwards. But when the movie The Fighting Sullivans was made, they did have the Sullivan family out to California to help with directing that.
Right.
Joe Griffiths, you have a question.
When Spielberg accepted the Oscar for Best Director, he mentioned the Sullivan brothers as well as the Nyland brothers from, I believe, Utah. There was 4 of those brothers who also died in separate battles.
Yeah.
Hey, Joe Griffiths, how are you?
Todd, I want to thank you. I want to thank all the speakers, the host, the family members for this very brave, difficult story to tell. I got a million questions, but I only want to ask one. I get asked a question all the time about this, the 3 brothers that died on the USS Frankie Evans in Vietnam, and were fighting to get their names put on the Vietnam Wall. And the question I get asked all the time, the Sullivans come up, is why do we still allow brothers on the ship? My question, I guess, to Kelly is, thank you for your family sacrifice. But Kelly, was it a request of the Sullivans' mom and dad or was it a suggestion from the Navy that unless the brothers volunteer, which the Frankie Evans did, Gary, Greg, and Kelly Joe agreed to be on the ship together, was it a request from the Sullivans that no brothers ever be on a ship again unless they volunteer? Or was that a Navy suggestion that they don't do that?
I don't know that the family did that. I think it's just more of a Navy policy. Yes, that's a good question. But I'm also familiar with the Frankie Evans story. I'm very familiar with it, and I have a friend who has a close friend that was on, and that's a fight to get those names on the Vietnam
Well, we
Wall.
might need your help real soon.
Yeah, it's a real shame that we don't have them on the Vietnam Wall.
Thank you.
I've asked Julia Parsons to unmute herself because Julia, like your aunt Genevieve Kelly, was a Navy wave in World War II.
Great.
And Julia is 101. She was a code breaker, and she has joined us. Yeah, she's a remarkable person that the Washington Post just did a wonderful profile of her on Friday on Veterans Day. So actually, do you know what? I think she just accidentally, instead of unmuting herself. Oh, there you are. Come on, Julia.
Wow, Julia, what an honor to meet you. That's unbelievable. Wow.
And what I wanted to know is, does Julia remember this saga? She was very busy, of course, during the war, decoding Enigma.
Wow.
Let's see, Julia. Let's see if we can get this. Julia has a new iPad, so she's still fiddling with it a little bit. Well, while Julia's doing that, if there are any other questions, let me know.
I wanted Knut to, before, as we're getting towards the end here, because as the captain of the ship, your grandfather, obviously responsible for all the men, but there were some letters that you've seen that were written to, I guess, written to your grandfather. Could you tell that story?
Yeah, there were a bunch. I gave the letters to the museum in Waterloo, and I copied some. But here is one. By the way, my dad heard about his dad missing in early December. I have the telegram, so the families didn't hear until, as I recall, around January 12th, in that area, about a month later. But there was a series of letters that mostly mothers in desperation wrote my grandfather's wife. And here's one from a lady from Pittsburgh, California. Mrs. Goff, it looks like, but hard to read. But in the last paragraph, she says, if you know of any details of the sinking or anything about any of the crew being rescued, will you be kind enough to communicate with me? While our grief is great, that of the mother of the five must be greater. So it's, these mothers wrote these letters in desperation, and this woman recognized the loss of the Sullivans. So there's a series of these letters, and I guess, Pat, if anybody goes to your museum, they'd be able to view these, I suppose. But it's just one after another, letters saying my son was a good swimmer, because they just didn't know. I mean, it's, again, January, it's 2 months after the fact, and they didn't know, so they wrote that. But my dad said he knew in December for sure that he had lost his father. He got the telegram at the Naval Academy, but you could see his parents searching out. And I think, Kelly, you had said that your parents had actually known before they got the communication from the Navy.
They did. They heard about it through a rumor that was going around town. There was another sailor who was on a different ship that had been in the Battle of Guadalcanal, and he wrote a letter to his mom, who was in the Navy Mothers Club, and said, "Isn't it terrible what happened to the Sullivans?" So that's how she found out. And then she wrote a letter to the Navy Department. So it was January, like the second week of January, when the family found out. And they did send a naval officer to the house to let them know.
By the way, all these letters that it was my grandfather's second wife, so I say my grandfather's wife received, they were immediately written that day. The day they got notice, every letter's dated the same day because they didn't know who to go to. So interesting. So
Julia Parsons is unmuted. Julia, do you remember the Sullivan brothers in this incident in World War II? Oh, we can't hear you. Can you believe that after all this?
Oh,
We can't hear you. I think it could be that your earphone issue again. Perhaps.
so disappointing.
Oh, so disappointing. Oh, yes. Oh, she's such a treasure and a superstar. So we're just gonna have to admire you from afar, Julia. Glenn, is there any other
Just one last point to wrap up the story. I mean, we could go on for a long time, and I appreciate all of our guests contributing tonight. But as you saw in that video, if you recognized some of the underwater pictures taken, the Juneau was actually found in 2018 by Jeff. You want to tell the story?
Oh, okay. Paul Allen, the research vessel Petrel, found the Juneau on St. Patrick's Day of 2018, which was just another one, just another coincidence. It's just not possible to orchestrate that much luck. But,
and these are a couple of pictures that Jeff had sent me. This is obviously the Juneau before it was sunk. You see 1 and 2. What are 1 and 2 there, Jeff?
Yeah, this is just referring to the underwater photos that follow.
Oops, wrong way. There we are.
So number 1, this is one of the depth charge racks on the fantail of the Juneau, and it was my understanding that George was a gunner's mate, 2nd class, and that his battle station was on the depth charge. So this would have been his battle station. And this is turret number 5, which is the waist turret on the starboard side of the ship. So it was right behind this turret that crack developed on the across the short axis of the hull. And one of the reasons why, when the ship exploded, it fractured along where the broken keel was, and a lot of the survivors, in addition to being on above deck at the time, were also stationed on the fantail of the ship.
Right. Okay. Well, it's time that we wrap up. It's hard to even bring it all the words. But first, let me thank our 4 guests for being on the program and sharing their excellent knowledge and emotions about this tragic event. Jeff and Pat, thank you very much. Pat, thanks to your museum and the people of Waterloo and having that museum and remembering all of these brave men.
Well, a little footnote for your people in Pittsburgh. Wyatt Butterfield received the Bronze Star for jumping in the shark-infested water to retrieve that. And after the PBY pilot saw that happen, he said to hell with the orders and landed and pulled those guys out of the water. There was a crew member, Bill Anderson, was here for an event in '92, and he said he knew there were sharks in the water. He hoped to get the survivors out, but he said he didn't think he even got wet pulling them out because he was so scared of the sharks.
Wow. Yeah. I'd love to come to Waterloo and see that museum.
Please do. Please do. We'll give you the royal tour.
Next time, Penn State, the University of Iowa in Iowa.
VBC road trip. I think a
There you go.
VBC road trip would be perfect. Hey, thank you so much, Glenn Flickinger, for hosting this event.
And just
thank
one
you,
last thank you to Kelly and Knut. Thank you so much.
Kelly and Knut, especially to hear how that, the trauma of this event does go down generations is really sobering. Thank you so much. I want to invite everybody to tune in on Monday night at 7 p.m. when we have a program, our VBC happy hour, that's going to cover the Sante raid of 1970. This was a special operations attempt to rescue 60 odd American POWs in North Vietnam in 1970. An interesting story. We're going to have veterans who participated in that raid. I also want to let people know we have a magazine called VBC Magazine. It's published every quarter, where we take the stories that we hear at our events and we put it in written form and we send it out to anybody who wants to receive it. We send it out to about 7,800 households, and we then send out another 7,000 or so for hand distribution. If you don't receive one of these, it's because we don't have your address. Just let us know your address and we'd be happy to put one in the mail to you. You can email me at todd@veteransbreakfastclub.org. That's Todd, TODD, @veteransbreakfastclub.org. And then finally, we have a survey that we encourage people to fill out. And it's a 3-question. It'll take 2.5 minutes. You go to SurveyMonkey, and I will put the link here in the chat. This just 3 simple questions. Would love to have you fill it out and let us know how we're doing. We monitor the survey very closely for hints and suggestions for how to do a better job here at the Veterans Breakfast Club. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I'm putting it in the chat right now, that survey link. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Pat and Kelly and Canute and Jeff. Take care. Good evening, everybody.
Bye-bye. Night. Thank you.